Good morning, everybody. For this session, under the title, Business Will Define the 21st Century, can we envisage companies other than an entity that is to generate profit, maybe one for the public good, and if so, how? So we have 6 people with us in the studio and in duplex. We have Bris Rocher, you're CEO of Groupe Rocher. And with us, we also have Thierry, who's the CEO of the Meridiam Investment Fund, who invests in sustainable in investments. Then we have Jeanne, Philip Morris France, world leader of tobacco, who ambitions a world which is tobacco-free. We also have Alexandre, hello, founder of Epic, a non-profit startup who works with social organizations, and also you work with Blis that invests with startups. In the studio, we have also Fatoumata Janngo, and you fund SMEs and African startups. And duplex with us in the United States, we have Rosabeth, KANTER, professor at Harvard's Business School. Good afternoon, and thank you for being with us. We're going to give you the floor and to launch the discussion. Olivier, BABEAU, over to you. You're a professor at the University of Bordeaux and associate member of the Cercle des économistes, and you're coordinating this session. And you're going to set the scene for our reflection. Thank you, Laure. Allow me also to thank all of you for having accepted our invitation to talk about this very exciting topic. We only have 1 hour and 10 minutes, but it's probably better to be frustrated than bored. That's what we're going to try and do today. The COVID crisis has deprived us of Aix-en-Provence today, but at least we have a round table. And you know what the symbol about the round table is? The idea that no individual place is more important than another. So we have we've managed to get rid of the disadvantages of the lecture halls, and I think the discussion will be easier. Will companies define the 21st century? Is this a question or a statement? What we can say is that it really did define the 21st century. It has so far, whether it be for the good or for the worse, because we criticize companies due to negative externalities. They produce pollution, social problems that they believe they're not responsible for or accountable for. Companies have been criticized as exploiting people, being a place of conflict, a place that has to be constrained and taxed. Quite funnily, we also talk about profit-making companies. We're talking about non-profit making on countries, and the companies and people criticize them as not having an objective. So companies during the crisis have managed to change what they do, and so maybe people at one point, certain companies also do things for the common good, and this is what we've seen come out: is this a position which is between public process, which is virtuous, and private processes, which are rather egotistical. So how far are corporate dynamics, can they be reconciled with the environment and social demands? What about issues related to general interest? And this is what we're going to be talking about today. And Anne-Laure, back to you to launch the debate. And André Rocher, we're going to Bris Rocher, talk to you first, because you've decided to make your company into one with a mission. What does that mean exactly, and how can you really change the game? Well, I think that the corporate world today, companies today, is the best tool we have available to improve things. If we think about it, it generates diversity, integration, and a company is only worthwhile if it can meet its customers' needs. So, of course, maybe the awareness has been slow coming, but it's there. And the companies today have no further choice than to meet the customer's needs. So a company with a mission, what is that? For me, I have a very clear definition of what a company with a mission is. It's a company that brings together economic performance and the common good. However, there's a meaning in my phrase. I first will begin with economic performance. A company can only exist if it is able to pay the wages, the rent, and therefore it needs to earn money first and foremost. Then, in order to meet the consumer's needs, we need to work for the common good. And what's interesting with the Pact law, which was promulgated in France last year, is that this law invites us to question the role of our companies, to define our raison d'être. And I think that the reason for existing of a company is something. First of all, for the employees, it's the employees also have to decide why they do what they do. And what is important is to determine your combat, your fight. So a company with a mission can't fight on all fronts at once. To the contrary, it will sacrifice its profitability. And so it's not that the other fights are not important, but you have to choose what camp you're going to fight in and stick to it. And so our mission is to reconnect men and women with nature. Why? Because we went and really looked at in the roots of the company. It was my grandfather who always had rather serious health issues, so far so that he was obliged to have homeschooling. And so there was a very close relationship between him and his father. However, he lost his father at the age of 14 years old. It was a family drama. Just think back to 1944 in a small village in Brittany, Agassiz, not a lot to do for a kid of that age. And he took refuge in the nature in Brittany, and he spent his days in the forest, and it brought him a lot of comfort. And very early on, he was aware that nature has a very positive impact on our well-being. And by becoming aware of this positive impact of nature on our well-being, then you want to work for the planet. That's what he did constantly since the age of 14. And for me, this is our reason for being. It is, first of all, we have to go and look for it in the roots of society. It must meet a future and current challenge. That is the case. We're in an increasingly urban world, surrounded by technology. We've become very remote from nature, although we are products of nature. So it's very important for each of us to reconnect. And we must also make sure that this reason for being is specific to the company. A very simple exercise to do to make sure of what you're doing. Take the headed paper of your main competitors, and you write down your reason for existing, and either it looks good, either it doesn't look good and you try again, or it does look good and you come together. So Thierry, responsible investment is how you want to have a positive impact on the environment. So it's a question of survival, according to you. Yes, it is a question of survival. And we can say today that we can be optimistic. I'm speaking from the position of a long-term investor. We manage 8 billion of assets for global institutional investors. And this wave of transformation and awareness has picked up its pace since the COVID, since the climate conference in 2021, and even more so today. So today, investors are asking the managers, the companies, and the things in which we invest to be responsible, but to have an economic performance that is equivalent to non-financial performance. And therefore, to be a company with a mission within the Liga status in September 2019, it means working on both fronts at the same time. So a performant investment in the long term for our investors, but the investors also require a non-financial performance. So the problems with for the company is that there is a declaration of intention or just declarations. We need to measure the impact and measure this non-financial performance. Because financial performance is easy to measure, but the impact of non-financial performance is rather more difficult to measure. So you need to align your company, your economic model, and the performance and pay of your employees and managers must be aligned with this mission. Therefore, you must define your mission your reason for existing, but also to define the indicators that allow you to prove that you have fulfilled the mission, because you might have some rather grandiose missions. But if we think carefully about it, we have to really go down into the concrete details. So we've chosen, for example, 5 very clear pillars. It's quite easy for us because we invest in infrastructure. So it's resilient and sustainable infrastructure, which is a sustainable development objective. The energy transition, climate, and the lowering of carbon emissions is a measurable objective. So this, besides this, we also have an objective to reduce social inequalities, because it's not just a question of environment and climate. And biodiversity is our 5th pillar. And therefore, this measure is essential. First of all, because it allows you to have meaning with your employees, your investors, and also the external stakeholders. Because I think that in this world of transformation, the public is naturally skeptical when big companies or investors say we're a company with a mission, we have a reason for existing, and the question is how, why, and show me what you do. And so it's very important to immediately engage in this measurement of impacts, otherwise we have no credibility. And this wave is positive and it's continuing to move ahead. So yes, you need to show and prove these engagements. I'm now going to turn to you, Jeanne Paulès. You operate in a sector, the tobacco industry, which has engaged in socially responsible investment. In this context, and with the impact of tobacco, how can a company such as Philip Morris really position itself in this field? It's quite difficult. It's difficult to say that you can also put your stone to the edifice. So yes, as people who work in the tobacco industry, can we pretend that we can improve the world as it is with its risky behaviors? Well, Philip Morris International has a very strong belief, and that's that the 21st century can be the century where cigarettes might disappear. Not because smokers decide to stop nicotine, to give up nicotine, but because today there are better alternatives and better choices than to continue to smoke. For over 10 years, we've been investing almost $7 billion in research and development around new technologies and scientific progress to bring a solution to the question of cigarettes. The question of cigarettes today does not come from tobacco or nicotine, but the problem, it comes from combustion. Therefore, we've been looking for something that rids us of this combustion. Today, there are platforms, be they electronic cigarettes that heat liquid nicotine, or platforms that use tobacco but which heat the tobacco rather than burning it, and this significantly reduces toxic emissions. So, of course, we must be cautious because there's not a zero risk. They're not products that can be used by everybody. They're products which, of course, are for smokers. It's a better choice for their health, for them, for the people around them, than to continue smoking. But this transformation in which we have engaged, which it is staggering, because you must understand that we've decided to self-destruct. We found a solution to the negative externality of our product, and this product will eliminate the historical existing product. So this transformation is done with regard to the product, but more globally speaking as well. So this is where we are careful to associate business strategies with CSR strategies, because we want to make sure that this transformation, which impacts us but which will also impact our partners, is not a process that leaves the people with whom we work along the way. So that's why we have developed a CSR approach based on 4 pillars. First of all, business transformation, so innovating for better products. And we have an ambition for 2025, which is 40 million users of our platforms who would have continued to smoke, so 14 million people who are using reduced risk products. We have a second pillar, which is operational management. How can we act with excellence and responsibility? The products we're talking about are not for everybody, so we must also measure the impacts and reduce the negative impacts of these products. The third pillar is the social impact of this transformation. We work with more than 33,000 suppliers across the world. We have 73,000 employees across the world, more than 330,000 tobacco producers. We can't just say we're going to transform our industry and just leave them along the way. And the fourth point is really the environmental footprint. And we've announced that by 2030, our production sites would be neutral in carbon emissions. So we've seen this transformation concerns us, concerns the people with whom we work, but it can only be effective on condition that the public authorities also play their role. Yeah, we'll have the opportunity of coming back to that later on in the next discussion.
Thank you, Alexandre Mars. I'm turning to you now. After created and sold a few times several companies, including Phone Valley, one of the first agencies in Europe, you chose philanthropy and investment as a means of action to have a positive impact on your environment. I want to stop at the philanthropic part. What was the trigger for you? I'm delighted to answer the question, but it was already a while ago. And there was no real trigger. It's something that was there since a very young age, and I just needed to have the means to do it. The ambitions were there, and they had been there for a while. Since a kid, I wanted to dedicate my life to those who had less chance in life than I did. And to do that, there's a lot of possibilities. The one that I chose is to use my qualities, my skills, and my skills are an entrepreneur. So I created a company, I sold them, and I created a new company called Epic, and I became a social entrepreneur. That's what I would have liked to do more. But I had a conversation one day with someone who asked me the following question: what makes you unique? It's somebody who's a mentor in the US, and he says, what is your uniqueness? And for Bris, for everyone around the table, there's a lot of things that you want to do to make tomorrow a better world. But there's one place, one area where you're a little bit better than others. For you, Thierry, it's probably the finance side, you know. So to have an impact tomorrow is you need to know what makes you unique. So make sure what makes you different. And for me, it was entrepreneurship. So the trigger didn't come when I had my first check. It was more like I finally had the means to do it. My mission was always there. I have a mission. My life mission is to take care of those who suffer. And in order to do that, I need to have money, financial money, resources, connection, network, and that's the topic of today. How does a company of the 21st century going to have an impact? And we say it very often, and we had this conversation just before coming on stage. For 30 or 40 years, we haven't done anything. CSR, you were mentioning it, in most cases is kind of a smokescreen, you know. It's 10 lines in a business plan. So we were talking about it. We have something more real. A company with a mission becomes to be serious. I was listening to you, and I have this number. It's a recent survey. 92% of people who are asked are agreeing with the strategy of positive impact in their company. What is less positive is 4% of these people think that the company is not part of a positive approach because of the lack of will of the leaders of the company. So we see that there's a will that is real, and it comes from the employees, it comes from the consumers, and it is driving the whole of the industry to evolve. And it hasn't been the case for quite a while. We had the truth that we had, the absolute truth, the one that we built ourselves, that are collapsing today. And the crisis that we're in right now is showing what we saw, what we anticipated. Is the world of today is getting out of breath. And the question is, what is next? If we don't have people like Bris, Thierry, who said we're going to do things differently, we're not going to get out of it. And profitability is very good. And that's a really good thing that you said, Bris. Profitability is key. But who defined that you have a profitability of 15 points, 20 points? You need profitability, of course, but this amount that was defined by who? Today we know it's computers and, trading rooms who defined what your goal should be. But Mr. Everybody does not understand that. So we're going to need to create this connection between the company, between the public powers, and between the consumer, who at the same time is an employee. So recreate trust, rebuilding trust, a link. Yes, absolutely, a link that disappeared. Thank you very much. Fatoumata, you are going to tell us about the African continent, because after working as a consultant for major companies, leading companies, you decided to start a capital risk investment fund to help SMEs or startups. It was a way for you to have an impact on the society and on the environment. Absolutely. Imagine yourself in a context of emerging country, and in Africa, the sense of urgency is not the same. The pressure does not come only from the consumers or the talents that you need to attract. It doesn't come from the regulators. It's a sense of urgency that comes from the challenge of development, because we have a contact that we are 1.2 billion. So we'll have triple our immigration in numbers in 10 years. So we need to reinvent and accelerate and massify the means and give access to the vast number of Africans, which is education, electricity, financial services. And in order to do that, it's the company that is going to drive that and that is going to compensate the failure of the governments. To give you an example, we have 3 million jobs that are created on the continent, and we need to create between 20 and 30 millions. So if you look at who creates jobs in Africa, it is SMEs. We have over 20 million of them. They represent 20 to 40% of our GDP, but 90% of formal and informal jobs. That's why it's essential. And the reason of being of most of African companies is to give access to energy. You have startups in Kenya who connect people who would not have access to an electrical infrastructure otherwise. You have startuppers who work in the world of health or telemedicine, which is essential because we still have only very few hospital beds for the number of inhabitants. And on education, it's even more important because if I take the example of Ivory Coast, we should create one classroom every day to be able to put all the children to school. If I take the example of Nigeria, there's 1.2 million who are students who are admitted to enter the university and cannot go to university because there's not enough space in the university. So our reason for being, we don't have a choice, is to combine economic performance because, of course, you need a sustainable model. I believe in philanthropy, but it's not enough because you really have behind it the capacity to use the profits into a sustainable development. And we need to have a social impact, create jobs, and combine the environmental aspect. And we don't have the luxury to wonder if we should do it or not. The question is how to do it and how to make access available. That's why I spent a lot of time wondering what do I want to do. And I created this company, and as a success, has become a unicorn. And my second bet was to quit the world of entrepreneurship and become an investor, because we need to invest in the sector. So you have a strong impact. Just to have an idea, how many companies do you finance? We have a portfolio over 21 African countries. We finance between 50 to 500,000 euros, and the African capital is very unequally spread. 90% is in Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. We also work in Senegal, Ivory Coast. It's not well spread, equally spread. We have 42 billion euros for women's entrepreneur, and that's very important for us. We are a company that is turned at 60% towards women employment, and it works very well. Thank you very much. Thank you. So we're going to have the conclusion of this first round of table. Rosabeth KANTER, you are a professor at Harvard Business School. Companies claim to be an actor of change. Is it the way you feel as well? Is it how changes can happen?
Very much. Thank you for having me. I'm talking to you from my home office in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I was thinking in listening to the conversation about why companies start creating change. This is my new book called Think Outside the Building. You talked about externalities. It's when companies feel responsible for the things happening outside the company that they make change in the world. And in fact, today, companies are increasingly aware of all the things happening outside of their buildings, their silos, their sectors that are affecting their ability to stay in business, let alone serve the public. And pandemics, inequalities, climate change, increasingly, these issues are being embraced by some businesses. I don't want to say all of them, but some businesses, because they understand the impact it has on themselves as a business entity, but also on their employees, their customers, the communities in which they live. And there is a lot of evidence through the years. This has been a theme now for at least 20 years in people who observe, write about, or consult to businesses, a major theme. And included in that theme is evidence that, in fact, companies, as we heard earlier, that have both a financial mission and a societal mission, an institutional mission, are much more likely to survive over time. And that's very important evidence. So it's companies like Procter & Gamble, which was founded in 1837, IBM, which is the oldest surviving large tech company or tech company of any kind. These are companies who have had financial performance, not necessarily always at the top, but they had sufficient financial performance to sustain themselves, as well as a societal mission to make a difference in the communities and countries in which they operated. And the reason these things go together is that the companies who think far outside the building about their social impact are more likely to innovate. The trigger for innovation comes from unmet needs. Observing that the public doesn't have something. Gee, wouldn't it be wonderful to fill that gap? Procter & Gamble started out making soap. I must say, soap today turns out to be one of the most important things we can do besides face masks to contain the pandemic. But you start out, you innovate because you see there are things people need. Procter & Gamble had created through acquisition, a water purification tablet, seeing that safe drinking water was an increasing need all over the world. And even though they couldn't make money on it, because their social mission and values were so strong, they kept it alive by turning it into a not-for-profit organization to which Procter & Gamble could supply the water purification pills, which really worked, tablets for the water supply, and they could work in partnership with the United Nations and governments in countries that needed this. They could donate the product, they could continue to keep it alive. They won a prize, a global prize for the best idea for social impact. And I was a judge for that prize. It was from American Express, the financial services company. And I said, do we want to give a social innovation prize to a major for-profit corporation? But then I realized that this was an incredible benefit for the world and they deserved it. So innovation comes from having a social mission as well as a financial mission. It motivates employees. increasingly, I mean, we were listening to this. I was just hearing a set of people, especially, I think, the last few speakers, who are speaking from a position of strong personal values. Well, increasingly, the rising generations have strong personal values. Global surveys show us that. And in fact, younger generations, in a survey that had dozens and dozens of countries in it, had 3 things highest on their list of things they cared about. One was climate change, the second was wars and conflicts, divides, and the third was inequalities and disparities of various kinds, gender, race, and so forth. Well, this rising generation won't work for companies that don't exemplify action on those things. Consulting firms discovered that a long time ago. If they wanted the best and the brightest, they had to give them opportunities to serve their countries, serve their communities as part of their employment. One large global consulting firm gives people an opportunity for service as part of the orientation to the company. And then they want to know that the companies they stand for are doing good. And this also helps companies with their supply chain, because you have a more reliable supply chain if you are investing in the countries from which you're getting supplies. So there are so many reasons for business to want to innovate, to do good. And I think we may be at a tipping point where this becomes the norm.
Alors justement,
So, indeed, what you're saying is very interesting, because I wanted to hear Jeanne Pollis on this theme. How can a company in the tobacco sector be attractive today for young generations who are looking for meaning, as Rosabeth KANTER just underlined? How do you go about things? Is it easy today to attract young people today to Philip Morris? So first of all, I'm going to answer your question, but I would like to react to what Alexandre was saying. I think that today the question is, are we a company with a mission or a CSR company? I think that what counts is transparency. What is your reason for being? What is your vision? What are the indicators you put behind this to measure the progress you have achieved? And that you're transparent and open on the subject. And that is what means that companies can have a positive impact on life in general. And that is key, this effect of transparency and the indicators. And to answer your question, we have no problem attracting people. It's rather the contrary. I would like to explain why. Why? Because as you have understood, we are changing the core business of a multinational company which is doing very well. But we decided to do this because, once again, we're bringing a solution to a problem that nobody's been able to solve so far, apart from regulation and restriction. France is a very important place because there's a very strong regulation on tobacco. It's where the price of tobacco is highest and where tobacco consumption is the highest. More than 11 million smokers in France. And what do we do for them? It's not because you tell people they have to stop smoking that they will stop. So when you bear all of this in mind, and you see how in the past decade the company has really self-transformed, and the clear vision that we have with very clear, transparent indicators. Every year we print a report where we show everything, what our ambitions were, where we stand, how we're progressing. We have no problem attracting people because a lot of people want to participate in this deep-rooted change, because what we're doing will change the life of smokers, change the life of people who live with smokers. So a few years ago, we might have had problems attracting people, but not now, because people want to participate and have a strong impact on society. Bris, Rocher, your company, Yves Rocher, as you say, has been working on these themes for a very long time, the environment, maybe social themes as well, although recently you've become a company with a mission. Do you feel this quest for meaning in the people who apply to work for you, the willingness to commit to a company who brings meaning? Yes, quite obviously. We have become a company with a mission in the sense of the pact law. in France, but it's in the genetics of our company anyway. But what is important at this stage? Two elements. I would like to, of course, we all agree to say that a company is useful, that it must generate profits to exist. Of course, we all share that. The question that Alexandre raised is a question that I've been wondering about for a long time now, and which I keep coming up against, and I'm not the only one that has trouble with this. What is the right level of profitability of the company? And that's a real question. What is the right level of profitability of the company? And for me, the first answer we can bring to this is that it must be sufficient in order to be able to cope with shocks. I'll give you an example. Look at Patagonia, which is no doubt one of the most emblematic or symbolic companies in terms of companies with a mission. Its reason for being, it must be we're in business to save our home planet, something like that. Quite ambitious. Rosabeth Carriot resigned a month ago. And she's very emblematic. She was the CEO of this company since 2008. She's the one who contributed to Patagonia. The founder is at the origin of the PICOR label, which is the equivalent to what we can call the Pacte law in France, that goes in the same direction, resigned. And why? Because the level of profitability was too low. And then we come up against COVID-19 crisis, and they were not able to cope with the shock. So what is important for me is that the trees with the deepest roots resist time. And so the law that was voted in France is very good, but only on the condition that we really take the process to the end. There are 3 dimensions in this law. If you don't integrate the 3 dimensions, we will be accused of not playing the game, and the citizens would be right. The 3 dimensions. The first is an extended social objective. So apart from the economic side, we include social, environmental. Secondly, define your reason for being. But that's just can be just words on a wall, of course. And it's not a good reason to be this. And that's why you have to include the 3rd dimension, because the 3rd dimension is in the statutes writing down your reason for being, but above all, determine the objectives. Because what will characterize us are our actions. We will only be judged upon our actions. And to quote Sun Tzu, if we don't have an objective, we will never reach them. So from my point of view, the most important thing are the objectives that we set ourselves that we must make public, because people should be able to argue against these, not just legally, but in the media. It's a far worse court than the legal court, the media. I used to work for Arthur Andersen, and it's an audit practice. 85,000 people working in there was condemned by the media, but esteemed innocent by the court. So it all goes together. Otherwise, it's purpose washing, and citizens will be accused of purpose washing, and citizens would be right. So there's people mix up reasons for being, and a lot of people have, said they had a reason for being, but they don't take things to the end, and otherwise it will hit us back in the face. Yes, profitability is a very important point, and I think it's a subject which is the next subject. The 21st century, we'll have to define the real profitability so that we can pay people properly, so that we can meet the citizens' needs. So in the citizens, we said every 5 years, every 6 years, every 4 years, they will be able to vote. But what is just as strong as voting is your banking card today. I think that the Yves Rocher brand, if I think that they're not telling the truth, then I won't go and buy their products. If I believe what they say, then I will buy their products. So sometimes people consistently buy the same product, but what there must be is that there's an alternative that is credible and virtuous. If in an industry there is another brand that does about or exactly the same product at a similar cost, if you believe more in that product, you will buy it. The only example in the world of a company which says I will do something that we think is normal. We will pay the producers correctly. And so that is a basic and simplistic stipulate. They managed to do this. They didn't spend any money on marketing or communication, and it's become the first brand of milk sold in the world. So they're positively polluting the entire industry. And another point on PICO that you were quoting, earlier on we were talking about how could we manage to have a measurement of positive impact. There's what we call B Corps, and I encourage everybody to look at this standard. It's a bit like the ISO 9000 that we heard a lot about in recent years on quality. And B Corp is one of these standards. So they will audit your company on all of the subjects, environmental, societal, corporate governance, and you will have a score. And every 3 years, that score, you will be audited to see if you should continue to benefit from this label. So it's a very concrete way of demonstrating that today you're doing things as they're written down in the law. It's a measurement then. Yes, it is a measurement tool which was developed to begin with by all of those who are precursors, the Pentagonis that you're talking about. And today there are 3,500 companies in the world, and there's this fund you were talking about. They were audits, and we looked at whether you really had diversity, whether the tools used are the right, and it responds to this point to say it's better to write, but it's even better to do it. So on the Bicorps, one thing I would like to mention, because this label is very interesting. 30% of my group is Bicorp today. We're re-audited every 3 years, and this score is supposed to improve. If it doesn't improve, we lose certification. And that's interesting, because we are engaged in positive motion. Just to react to this, and I agree that Bicorps and the labels do help. A label is the reflection of the impact. It's a label that confirms that we are acting to achieve the impact we wish to attain. But we really have to measure it. We need to measure it in concrete terms, and I agree that there's a sustainability Bicorp label. We use these, but then we must be able to say to the general public, oh, this is what I've invested, and this year I've invested in this fund. It has a 1.5-degree trajectory. It has spared millions of tons of carbon, and I can quantify all of this. And this is even more concrete than the labeling, which is necessary, but it's just the first step to make things easier afterwards. Maybe I would like to react on the question of profitability as well. I don't have the solution, but the first step is to stop bringing into opposition profitability and non-financial performance. Because in the world in which I live today, and I hope that we will be able to demonstrate this with sufficient amount of data after 15 years of investment, we are able to show that our social responsibility decreases the volatility of our financial yield. So today, it's all tied up. It's a virtuous circle, and therefore profitability, maybe the absolute figure might be lower if the volatility is a lot lower as well. And therefore there is a certain amount of reflection, and this, of course, it will take a few years until we have more data, but we need to think about stopping bringing them into opposition, but realizing that the social and societal mission helps the financial mission. There's a correlation. I don't have the solution today, but every time we put them in opposition, it's very difficult to find the solution. I think we should never question just the question of profitability, but the global profitability. Yes, I think that beyond the labels and the measures, the measurement itself is virtuous, because when we looked at measurement tools, we looked at P&I and the Impact Investment Network, GPG, and we looked at Bicorps as well. And we said, well, people, it's very englobing, and we want to impact on development, and they aligned with SDGs. So with Zach's, they have very accurate measurements, so I can tell you upstream of an investment, because that's part of our process, how many direct jobs, indirect jobs, and induced jobs will be created, how many jobs for young people, how many for women, how many green jobs. And this granular measurement is never possible, and it becomes very restrictive. And just as a person, it can be focused on the financial return. Here, we have 60 million for African startups, and this is where we have part of our performance and pay, which is related to the impact measurement. And so it's no longer a question of good wishes or wishful thinking, but it's a question of interest for the stakeholders, but also the investors investing their capital.
I also wanted, of course, to ask you, because this is in the news, we talked about you, Bris, Rocher, what did the current crisis, the health crisis, the economic crisis that followed, what did it change in this dimension of companies at the service of the common good? Can it slow down the progress, or can it accelerate them? I think for me, it accelerated them. But let's go back to profitability, because for 3 or 4 reasons. Because we focused on very few topics. We were capable to produce masks in 4 days, hydroalcoholic gel in a week with Yves Rocher. You know, we focused on very few things, and it cost me a lot of money. It was very expensive. So profitability remains important. Taking into account the common good does not increase the profitability of my P&L. It may bring an immaterial value, but it's not going to increase the profitability of my P&L. My grandfather, when he started 10 years after his family drama, he fought the collectivization of agricultural lands because he didn't want to damage all the woods and all the paths, and because he realized that biodiversity was important for our well-being. He stopped also the test on animals 15 years before the law was passed. In 1997, his field with flowers, he decided to certify them agriculture, organic agriculture. Did it rise his profitability? No, not at all. It degraded it, but it brought an immaterial value. So it's more complicated than that. But by doing that, you're still existing today. The company is still here today. Yes, we'll always go back to there. Where do we place the cursor? It's a resilience over time that we have to look at. It's not profitability quarter by quarter. I think that in the goals that we set ourselves, we need to make a difference between the conventional objectives to the singular objectives. If you're looking at the Pact Law, you need to define a mission, a reason for being. For us, it's to reconnect men and women to nature. A singular objective is to plant trees. We don't do it to compensate our greenhouse emission. We plant trees because when we do it with our employees, we do it with our clients, we do it with our partners, with our suppliers, with the NGOs, etc. And so when we plant 1,600 trees, it takes about a day. It takes a while. We do it with others, and we reconnect with each other, and we reconnect with nature, and it feels great. So having said that, should we at the same time stop working on our greenhouse emission? No. That's a conventional objective. That is not specific. That should be commonly shared by all companies. And yes, here by 2030, we need to align ourselves with the reduction goal of greenhouse gas. And this year we're going to start with a logistics platform, which is in Lagacé in Brittany, which will be carbon free. In 2025, all of the sites in Lagacé will be carbon free, and then it will be all the sites in Brittany. So that's our conventional objective. L'Oréal probably has the same ones, Bayer's as well. But the fact that we plant trees as well, and we've been doing that since 2006. I have my tree, my kids have their tree. It's a family story. My uncle initiated that after he met Ungari Matai, who's Nobel Prize of Peace. He started planting trees, and now we're going to celebrate 100 million trees planted. It took us a lot of time, but that's good. We need to continue that way. I would like something came out of this health crisis, which is putting back science where it belongs and having exchanges and debates that are based on facts and that are concrete. So I want to raise this point because, of course, it's linked to the vision of the company. We all agree to say that a company should innovate. There are new technologies, there is science. Each company should innovate to deliver better products to its consumers with a positive impact for the common good. But at the same time, we should not neglect the importance of the role of the public authorities, and it's up to them to develop an environment that is regulated and necessary and that allows the consumers to have access to information and to make the good choices. And that's very important. And the whole debate during the health crisis has raised this issue. And we conducted a survey with Harris Interactive that we did last year. We did again a few days back to see the French citizen in relation to the science. And 76% of the French people tell us that the public authorities have a mission, have a duty to enlighten the citizens on the scientific situation, and they're conscious that 71% of them say that it's up to companies to innovate and progress science. And that's very important because one cannot go without the other. And I always have a hard time when people put on one side the companies and then public authorities. At the end of the day, the world will be a better place if both work hand in hand, based on facts and based on data. That's how we're going to make things progress. So what made us change during this health crisis, Fatoumata? I see some positive and negative changes as well. Negative changes, the crisis entails uncertainties, and if we're in the domain of capital risk, which is of course more risky than traditional investment, you have some actors that say, at the worst case, I cannot do any due diligence, I can't travel. So I see in some investment topic that are more risky than other fishing, and there's a sense of urgency that is even more there. But on the positive side, I see that the fundamentals of our conviction that technology will help us progress is more and more true. We have a company in our portfolio that is in the Ivory Coast that does logistics for SMEs, because in the U.S., the logistics represents 6% of the value of a product, and in Africa, it was up to 55% in Ivory Coast. So here, we wanted to have a balance between supply and demand, but in the midst of the coronavirus crisis, there's no more airplanes. So, of course, we had a major challenge to have access to medical supplies. So this startup reshifted all its activity to be able to ship some tests and equipment, protection equipment, all over the place. And there's an initiative that I'm very proud of, and I speak less as an entrepreneur but as a benefactor, that the African Union, looking what was happening in our region of the world, in our part of the world, versus France or the United States, we decided to create a platform, a supply platform that is consolidated for all countries of the African Union to give them access to artificial respirators and testing kits. And this is very important, and it's something that we may not have seen, we have the COVID crisis. And it included a lot of people, philanthropists and people from the African Union working hand in hand. And we're still in a situation where we haven't reverted the trend yet. Yes, you've seen all these initiatives emerge during this crisis. Yeah, there's a real awakening from citizens, and it goes through from the employees up to the CEO. We should not always put in a position the company leader and bosses and managers. And at the beginning of this crisis, we started a platform called Tous pour Tous, Everyone for Everyone, where we put forward all these incredible actions undertaken by SMEs from a small SME in Marseille, which lost 80% of its activity and still would go deliver organic bread to people who were in great precarity. So when the boss of the Maïf, which is a leading French and ceramics company, decided to pay back 100 million because he decided that the insured didn't use their company because they couldn't drive. So either we give them back to you or you can give them to charities. So these actions are more and more visible, and there are many more and more of them. And this crisis, and you said it very rightfully so, showed all these actions, because we'll be judged as a person, as a husband, as a spouse, as a citizen, and everything that we will have said will have limits. But what remains is your actions. And can we measure them, Thierry, perfectly, if we need this label or that label? I don't really care. But what matters is what I live is completely aligned with what I'm doing. And this is what we've seen more and more. The other example is Sébastien Bazin, who, the boss of Accor, he loses everything. There's not one single bed that is being rented. And I open all my hotels to battered women, to the health workers, to anyone who needs can stay in my hotels for free, and I don't give €1 to my stakeholders. So, to go back to what you're saying, what surprised me is I think that those who acted for the common good were those who was the most impacted. Take the Accor Group. All the hotels closed. There's no e-commerce. And on the contrary, those for who the COVID crisis was painless didn't do anything. Do you have names? Well, the lenders, for example, where are you at? I'm still fighting with them. Citrus, the Falsbourg company with Philippe Journeau. But if you take the major fiduciaries, nothing. Elisabeth KANTER, I would have, Rosabeth KANTER, I would like to hear you back again. So what do you think are the most important things of this crisis?
Is partly a short-term versus long-term issue. And it also is a matter of how much seems enough. And that's a values question. That's not a technical question. But in the short-term exploitation is not good for the economy. It also means there has to be some global consensus because some companies move their operations or exploit a country and then move. That happened in Africa, where the natural resources company extracted natural resources and then left in the short term, didn't build in the long term. So building for the long term has to be the watchword. And it's not necessarily also a question of for-profit, not for profit. I mean, for-profit companies benefit from social values. I happen to know Meridiam, and Meridiam, Thierry, you won a contract in Miami because of your values, because you were better equipped to think about the community as you built a new tunnel under Miami Harbor. So the goodwill is priceless. It's why goodwill is sometimes put on the balance sheet. In the COVID crisis, it is simply, we're seeing that it simply accelerates trends that were already there. First of all, it accelerates our dependence on technology. Remote work, remote speaking, as I'm doing now, are going to remain with us. They may not be the only way we operate, but they're going to be with us in the longer term. And for decades, Europeans as well as Americans have been arguing about the need for flexible work hours. Well, we now may finally have them. So better workplaces, physically or remotely, outside the building, will be the norm. Also in the COVID crisis, we're seeing that those who have values and have the loyalty of their workforce can pivot quickly, can move from manufacturing one thing to manufacturing, well, one company was making boat parts and now they're making plastic shields for health workers. Much more agile when there is a base of commitment to the company through values. The other thing we're seeing in COVID is that national leadership matters a great deal, but so does entrepreneurship. We're going to get through this crisis in my country and other countries in the world because of local action, because of entrepreneurs with new ideas, and those new ideas might be social ventures. They might be distributing groceries. They may be new ways of using the food supply chain. I know of a company that is now using food that would otherwise be thrown out, wasted, and bad for the environment. They're now distributing that food affordably, nutritious food in what we call food deserts, that is, poor neighborhoods that don't have access to nutritious food. So out of the crisis will come many imaginative solutions. It's why President Macron in France wants Paris to become a tech capital and wants to encourage entrepreneurs. I think that it isn't so much whether business will change, it's whether bureaucracies will change. It's whether we will begin to have nimble enterprises where people with values will get something done. They will be the ones who earn public approval, who earn the trust of their customers, and that's on a lot shorter cycle than voting. While authoritarian regimes may be growing, democratic regimes in the form of entrepreneurship
KANTER. Il nous reste
are
plus beaucoup de
also a
temps.
trend everywhere, including Africa.
Thank you. I'm sorry we don't have a lot of time left. We have less than 10 minutes to conclude this roundtable. I would like to take a few questions that have come to us from the listeners. We talk about remote working. There's a question from BABEAU, who is part of the 1828 system, the young generation who is asking us questions about remote working and the future of remote working. Is this the future? And has the crisis not shed light on this? Jeanne Pollis, is Philip Morris going to change its process? Well, yes, quite simply. The word flexibility is flexibility, and the company that must adapt to both professional and private lives of their employees. What does it mean? It means we move from everybody goes to the office to everybody stays at home. I don't think it's one or the other. It's a question of personal choice, and I deeply believe that companies that have developed an environment where everybody can, where it's possible, choose the way in which they want to work. Have you negotiated local agreements? Well, in France, we have agreements on remote working with 1 day a week. Of course, we've already reopened discussions with our partners to see how this can move on, because we need a framework, of course. We are in France. But flexibility is a choice for employees. And for you, Bris, Rocher, have you changed your position on remote working? Yes, I'm not for a 180-degree turnabout, but one point I find interesting, before the COVID crisis, we, with BVA, launched a barometer on reconnection with nature, because it's a good mission, but what about it? Do people feel connected, disconnected? How do things change over time? Are there differences between countries, etc.? And one of the very striking results, first of all, is there's a very clear correlation between declared happiness and connection to nature. The more connected you feel to nature, the happier you are. But what is interesting is what is obvious is that if you're disconnected from nature, it's due to a lack of time. And in this sense, remote working is a capacity to give people a bit of time back. Now, being present on the work site is important also, to be part of a group, and creative subjects cannot be dealt with remotely. So we need to find a fine balance between both. We can draw a parallel with profitability. Where do we put the needle? And that's the question that we will have to look at. I will also deliver this question of Brian Furman. With regard to relocation and the return of a strong state, how can we apprehend the place of companies? Thierry DEAU. Well, I think the place of companies remains the same. In the face of this crisis, the states, at least in Europe, have issued a very strong signal, which is that humans are the most important. I think that is something that will remain despite the discussions. And of course, the companies followed in the wake. They thought the same thing, but it is a political and societal choice that was made in most of the European countries to say humans come first. And if we have placed the church back in the heart of the village, then the reaction to the crisis and the place of companies, we stay in the same direction, but the pace is picking up. And what I do see is that public policies and those of companies have evolved much faster. The Green Deal, which seemed to be a bit of a gadget by Mr. van der Leyen to be elected, has actually become the main tool for the discussion to pull out of this crisis and the economic crisis in which we find ourselves. So all of these essential subjects in companies are the same. So by investing in infrastructure, I position myself directly behind the economic relaunch revival. And how can I impact? It's the same thing. So one comment that came in during the debate by Ouroboros: a company that takes into account the common good is good, but when the consumers don't care, what is the use? I wonder. So I know that you say, Bris, Rocher, that, no, you say that, Olivier, that no, if things are so hard that you don't have enough to pay your bills to the end of the month, people won't be worried about whether the product is organic or gluten-free. So the first and most important topic is how can we help these people to really have the means to pay all their bills at the end of the month. And the question beforehand was a very important question. I'm one of these people who consider that the 21st century will also really progress if companies learn how to work with the public. It's important. We need a real relationship. And today, the only body that is able to legislate on this, and it's good that you quoted your small village in Brittany 5 times, Bris, because that's France. It's not the startup nation. France is not just Paris. France is far more than that, and that's what's important. And only the state can legislate, and they have demonstrated that it is important to have a state that can understand that in order to reach certain objectives, we need to just give people a bit of a nudge in the right direction. Yes, to add, with regard to consumers, I think that companies or a brand no longer addressing consumers, but citizens, and a citizen that wishes to be aware of what they're consuming. And companies are facing community movements. Communities are committing to causes, and communities can form wherever they might be. And that's where the future challenges lie. So thank you for these discussions, these proposals, and these were very rich reflections. Olivier BABEAU, you followed the debate maybe a quick conclusion. Yes, good debates are like good concerts. You can't summarize them, you experience them. But I am going to quote 4 points that are symbolic of what you've all said. The need to look at the entire results of the actions. So a company can create value, but they use it for certain inputs, and they consume resources. So the question is, what are the results between the resources consumed, the use that is made of human work and natural resources, and what is produced? And you have to look at the entire results. You can see those that really create value and those that just make an illusion. Then there's the impact and the mission in the long term. The long term can be difficult. There is no love. There is just proof of love. So it's not just a mission alone. There's a proof of how you concretely put this mission in motion, and this must be based on facts. And of course, I heard somebody when they said that companies must cut. Public service doesn't necessarily mean public power. Private companies can also do good for the public. So the 21st century will be entrepreneurial or will not be. Thank you for having stuck to the time, and thank you for these discussions. Thank you, Rosabeth KANTER, for having been with us direct from the States in Massachusetts. Thierry DEAU, John Paulès, Alexandre Mars, and Fatoumata Bar. Thank you very much.